Thank you very much, Jess, and welcome everybody. So my name is Nick Murray. I'm a member of Chippenham Town Council's Climate and Ecological Emergency Advisory Group and Chair of Zero Chippenham, whose members are supporting the Town Council in addressing the climate emergency. This webinar is part of a series of climate conversations from Chippenham Town Council's CAD group aimed at sharing information on how people can address climate change in their daily lives. Previous webinars have included home energy efficiency, renewable energy, heat pumps, water conservation and sustainable commuting, including electric bikes. And I'd encourage you to go and watch some of those recordings on the Chippenham Town Council website, or send an email to inquiries@chippenham.gov.uk if you can't find them. Tonight's topic is electric vehicles, and we have four excellent speakers who will be presenting on different aspects of the subject. They are Steve Forster, who's a consultant in EV infrastructure and accelerated EV adoption for the Osprey EV charging network. Andrew Mckenzie, who's a consultant and sustainability advisor to the Gloucestershire Growth Hub. Dr. Alan Marion Davis from Nada Community Energy and Tisbury Electric Car Club. And not David Burns, it's Joseph Osborne now for ZapMap, the UK's leading app and digital platform for EV drivers. Each of our presenters will have 10 minutes to present, after which there'll be a 5-minute Q&A should you have any questions. I don't intend to introduce the topic, to say that electric vehicles are a key part of transitioning to a net zero society. And whilst we need greater investment in public transport, cycling, walking, electric vehicles do produce only a fraction of the life cycle emission of diesel and petrol vehicles, which is going to improve over time as our electricity supply is greener. So they're going to be a very important part going forward. So without further ado, I will introduce the first guest, Steve Forster. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, and thank you, Jessica, for arranging this. I'm really pleased to be here. I've got 10 minutes to present what normally I'll present in about an hour and a half. So forgive me if I'm quick, and I'm happy to take questions and do any follow-up. I'm just going to share my screen, which hopefully you can see now. If someone could give me a thumbs up that they can see that all right. Yeah, great. Okay, first thing, I'm not going to give you a product pitch or anything like that, but I'm going to just put it into perspective to give you a bit of a feel of who I am. First thing I'd say is I've been a petrol head for many years. I actually raced professionally. I still ride fossil fuel motorcycles because there aren't really many good alternatives. But I am now committed EV evangelist, and I've been driving electric for 10 years, done over 250,000 miles on electric power. I run the public sector at Osprey, delivering fully funded charges around the country. I also happen to be a county councillor. Somehow I managed to get elected. In terms of just perspective of Osprey, we do work for lots of people, including Transport for London, Cardiff City, lots of organisations. And the reason I've got that slide up is it's just a clue that this is not a niche. This is something that everybody is getting involved in, from Shell and the petrol companies, through town and district councils, through organisations like Burger King and Starbucks. It's on everyone's interest topic. What Nick asked me to cover a little bit is just some of the key things to do with choosing an electric vehicle and the main myths and issues that surround it. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the core types of electric vehicles. And there are three main categories: a pure battery vehicle, a plug-in hybrid vehicle, and a non-plug-in hybrid vehicle. Can I say first and foremost that the last of those have been around for many years. They're a complete waste of space if you're considering going electric, because they aren't really electric vehicles. They have very limited range, and they're basically a fossil fuel vehicle that was designed to meet some government legislation, but is pretty much gone now. So we're focusing on the plug-in hybrid vehicles and the pure battery electric vehicles, which is where the market is going. In 2035, all hybrids will be banned in terms of new vehicle sales. The intent really from government is that we move to pure electric by 2030. Sales are absolutely rocketing. They've doubled in the last year, and they're going faster than that in the current year. The manufacturers can't produce enough. And you'll notice that the plug-in hybrids actually rose even faster, but that growth has pretty much fallen off a cliff in the last few months because government removed many of the tax incentives from them, favoring battery electric vehicles. So that's where you're going to see the growth. And roughly 1 in 6 cars now is an EV. So I could spend hours talking about some of this, but the one thing I'd like you to take away from today is try one, because I'm pretty certain you'll like it. They are nicer to drive than pretty much any other vehicle. Nicer performance, nicer handling, nicer features built in, because it's the latest technology partially. However, they're no more difficult to use. They are cheaper to run. They are absolutely zero emission if they're pure battery. They are safer, some of the features built in, and they are incredibly reliable. What's the but? Well, the cons. They do have a higher purchase price, but we're seeing parity now in terms of total cost of ownership. The actual cost of buying and running an EV, because the running costs are so much lower, is actually far more affordable, and you've actually got parity, maybe even a preference in some areas, particularly when there's things like congestion charge, in favor of EVs now. And we'll actually have parity on pricing probably in the next year or two. People talk about range anxiety. I'm going to talk about that. It's not an issue with the ranges that you're seeing nowadays. There's doubts about some of the charging networks, and that's very valid, but you've probably got the same concerns. Many of us prefer to get our petrol from a Shell or a BP or a Tesco rather than a Merco or some of the lesser known brands. A lot of those doubts actually tend to be a bit false. Concerns about battery life. These are not the same batteries that are in your mobile phone. And I'll talk about that very briefly. There's a worry about some of the tech, which is fair. And there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, a FUD factor about hydrogen. Let me make one thing really clear. The manufacturers are focusing on delivering battery plants and battery electric vehicles. They were dabbling in hydrogen, but that's almost gone away. Most of the manufacturers or people who were testing hydrogen vehicles have pulled out of that market. It just isn't viable. And one of the things I'd like you to take away is that it takes roughly 3 times as much energy as it does for a battery car to make hydrogen and then use it in effect in a battery car. It's just inefficient dramatically. Happy to dwell on that. There's 12 million electric vehicles now around the country. I think if you, around the world. If you asked how many hydrogen vehicles, I think it's probably a few hundred. Doubt it even gets into 5 figures, let alone 4. So we mentioned range, which is one of the classic things that if you talk to Jeremy Clarkson at Top Gear, if you read the Daily Mail, they'll all say range anxiety is the real thing. A lot of the vehicles now have a standard range of between 200 and 350 miles. I don't tend to drive 200, let alone 350 miles without taking a stop for a bite to eat, because that's 4 hours driving, maybe 6 hours driving. And when you stop, the charging is really quick. There are still some vehicles on the market that have small batteries and have a limited range. For many people, that's actually sufficient. The bottom of this chart has a 100-mile range. Many people don't drive more than 12 miles a day. That's the average. But I would suggest some of the newer technology around the 200 to 300-mile range is actually much more desirable. Charging locations and range anxiety go hand in hand. And there's a really brilliant tool you'll hear about later on called ZapMap, which we use. If you look at ZapMap, you will see there are thousands of chargers. It's difficult sometimes to tell whether chargers are in single sites or, like in the picture down there, 4 chargers at a time, or the ones up in Cardiff, 2 chargers. But there's a move now for more chargers combined in locations, just like you have with petrol pumps. But something that's really different in this market, because it will take 10 to 90 minutes on a rapid charger to charge your vehicle, or 8 to 12 hours on a fast charger to charge your vehicle, is the chargers are sited in different types of locations. And the type of charger and the speed has to be selected properly. And one of the things that drives that is the amount of range you're adding for every hour you're plugged in. And you'll hear talk about fast chargers or AC chargers. They will add 10 to 30 miles of range for every mile they're plugged in. A rapid charger will add between, depending on the speed of the charger, 150 miles of range to 750 miles of range for every hour it's plugged in. So you can see on those rapid chargers, they're ideal for trunk roads, motorways, long distances, or a fortnightly top up. Whereas the fast chargers are ideal if you've got a charge, excuse me, if you've got a charger at home or in the workplace, somewhere you're going to be for 8 to 10 hours. And that's the difference between charging hubs and destination charging. Destination charging is somewhere you're going to spend a bit of time, possibly, whereas a charging hub will tend to be en route more often than not. I talked about that issue with hydrogen and the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's no longer an issue. You're not going to see many hydrogen vehicles. But on batteries, I mentioned the technology is not the same as you'll find in your mobile phone, where the batteries die after a year or two. These batteries are actively managed and are designed with a design life of 20 years. And most manufacturers are warranting them for 10 to 12 years. Some may reduce that to 7, but that's an awfully long warranty compared to a normal motor and all the ancillary parts that is 1 to 3 years. These things are reliable and they're fully recyclable at the end. Don't be confused. They are fully recyclable at the end of life. And they even have second life used in homes or grid battery storage. So when you're looking at an EV, what are the things to think about? Well, the first thing is whether it's financially viable, because they may have a higher cost. Even the used ones hold their value better, so they don't depreciate as much. And I think that's going to continue for a long time. Do the research, look at the numbers. Look at what's new and used. Yep.
Apologies, Steve. We're just getting a bit tight for time, just so we have.
This is my last slide.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. Do get a home charger if you've got somewhere that you can put one in. Make sure you're on a good tariff, and make sure that the dealer you engage with or people who advise you actually know what they're talking about and can hand over properly. So I hope that's helpful. Happy to take any questions.
That was really good, Steve. Thank you very much indeed. Kerry, do you want to organise the questions? I'm happy to do it, or if you would, that'd be great.
We've had a couple of questions in the chat from Ben, who lives in Chippenham and is concerned about residential EV charging points. For example, if you head straight out onto a double yellow line, and how to kind of overcome that. And then some more general concerns from Bill around, the pricing of charging suppliers and the queues at motorway sites and things. So I don't know if that's an ideal time for these, or maybe they'll be picked up later with somebody talking a bit more about charging. And if anybody's wants to put their hand up if there's any additional questions at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. I can probably cover those. In terms of residential charging, a lot of people have the ability to put a charger in at home and charge off street. That's great. Many councils are now installing residential fast chargers on street. It's not as easy as it seems. It's not just a case of plug one in or put one on a street lamp. There's quite a lot of cost attached. But generally, where they're doing that, the parking regulations are amended to make that fairly much a formality. And certainly in Chippenham and Wiltshire, there's a lot of forward thinking councillors and staff at the council, so that's being looked at. Sorry, I didn't write down the second question.
The second questions were around sort of concerns about the pricing of charging,
Okay.
whether that can kind of be a rip-off, particularly, you know, with a related point around as you're getting increased demand with queues on motorway sites and things and being able to access.
Thanks, Kerry. Okay, in terms of pricing, most of the manufacturers now have their pricing very visible, and it's a little bit like with petrol, it's not quite as competitive, but the price of charging is generally done on a per kilowatt, so you'll know roughly what the costs are. It's always going to be cheapest to charge at home. There's no doubt about that. But with some of the electricity costs, you have to be careful of that. Charging networks will charge you between typically 20p and 70p per kilowatt. At the top end, it's where they want to discourage other people. Most of the sweet spot is 25 to 40p. Some are a bit more expensive, but you can choose. There's really good choice, and hopefully ZapMap will cover that. As far as queues on motorways, etc., the motorway network has been really badly served. It was a monopoly until very recently, and the supplier that was doing it did a very poor job. That is changing, and you're finding more and more charges, but I think ZapMap will give you some figures on the numbers around. We're seeing the volume of charges rising roughly in line with the number of vehicles, and I expect that to actually change in the future with many more chargers coming on stream. I know Osprey, for instance, currently has around 250, 300 charging stations. We expect that to grow massively over the next 2 years, about sixfold, something of that order. And I think most of the other charge point operators are doing the same. So yes, you could say there are a few problems. They're a bit overrated, and I think the problems will lessen as time goes forward.
Thanks, Steve. Ben, I've noted your comment there that hasn't really sort of addressed your question fully, and you'd like to hear from your town and county councillor. But I am going to come to some of the other questions first, because there's quite a few. Julian, you've got your hand up and you've got 2 questions in the chat. So maybe if you'd like to ask your question for yourself, and then we'll come to William.
All right, thank you. Just very quickly. So the first question was, wondered if you had a figure for the overall emissions of an electric car compared to a petrol one, taking into account the electricity generation emissions with our current grid mix, just to give us a figure. I know it's going down as the grid gets better. And the other one was, with electric cars, obviously, the overall aim is to reduce the number of cars on the road at the same time as making them electric. And car clubs are a really good way of doing that. And I just wondered if you were supporting car clubs at all, because they drive sort of behaviour change and make you think about each journey, and they're particularly sort of suitable for charging points and things like that.
Julian, thanks for your 2 questions. I'll take the second one first. Yes, we're very actively supporting car clubs. Most of the car clubs are now either thinking of or have already moved to EVs out of preference, and we support them with charging points at our charging hubs. We're actually in discussion with some of the car clubs about making those locations, the urban hubs in particular, that the car clubs can use. And we do work with some of the leading UK developers of housing to put in charging alongside car club spaces. In terms of the overall emissions, I haven't got their figures to hand. I'm sure we can provide those to you. But there's a lot of scientific data now available that shows that the overall carbon footprint of an EV over a typical 5-year life is now significantly lower than of a typical fossil fuel vehicle. But I'm sure you'll want to see the figures, so we can get that to you.
Thanks so much, Steve. We need to move on to the next speaker now, but I would just encourage people to have a look in the chat, as I know Matthew and William have put a couple of helpful suggestions and tips, and Jez has asked a very specific question about kind of the type of a plug-in hybrid and whether it's a good compromise or not, and maybe Steve can have a look at that question and answer directly in the chat. And yeah, I'd encourage other people to have a look there when you get a chance. But on to the next speaker now, I think.
That's great. So thank you very much, Steve. And we'll go on to Andrew Mckenzie. We could come back to some of these questions at the end if there's time. Otherwise, hopefully we'll get some answers within the chat as the conversation goes on. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you for the opportunity to have to share some thoughts with you on this. It was interesting that hydrogen came up in topic. I might touch on that as well because my background. By way of a bit of introduction, so I first drove an electric car 2013. I first installed electric vehicle charging points at an employer in the same year. I also had the opportunity to phone up Tesla at Westfield when that was their only retail outlet in the UK and said, hey, look, I work for a company that is focused on reducing its carbon emissions. And I hear you've got a Model S in the market. Can I take one to my directors to give them a test drive? They said yes. Problem being, it's on Dutch plates, it's a left hooker, and we can't deliver it. So unfortunately, I had to go to Westfield and then drive it through the Cotswolds to bring it back, which was a tough day out for me. But I can tell you, it was a rip-roaring ride. In a former life, I used to be head of corporate social responsibility for a Queen's Award winning business, logistics firm with a fleet of about 130 or so vehicles across the country, 30 of those commercial vehicles, and about 100 or so were car vehicles, were passenger cars. And consequently, 90% of the business's overall carbon footprint was associated with vehicle movements. So my role was to try and drive that down, hence looking at alternative fuel types. So if you want to go on to the next screen, next slide. So I was trawling back through my archive of vehicles that I've been to and sat in and had the privilege of driving. And I would 100% advocate what Steve said. If you've not driven an electric vehicle, get in one. The manufacturers are just desperate for that experience, bums on seats. Once you've tried it, you kind of ask yourself, why would you want to go back to something that's noisy and vibrates and shakes and has lots of moving parts? Because the experience is just, it just makes driving so much more relaxing and easy, frankly. So where I'm going to be talking to you just over the next couple of minutes here is about my experience, both as from a fleet perspective, what I've experienced and seen, but also as a personal EV driver as well. On this slide, the one curveball on there is the image right at the top in the center. The rest of those are all plug-in battery electric vehicles. The one at the top is a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. And actually, my personal view is that hydrogen 100% has a place in the blend of electrified vehicles. That vehicle is taking hydrogen. It can refuel fully in about 5 minutes. And that's generally good for about 350 miles, something like that. So whereas there's all this talk of electrified vehicles being able to hypercharge 350 kilowatts, 0 to 80% charge in 15 minutes, actually a hydrogen car can do all of that right off the bat. So there is a place, but 100% my view is that the incentives are all pushing towards battery electric vehicles, hence why it's a very rare sight seeing a hydrogen fueled vehicle. However, Wiltshire and our region, we do have 2 hydrogen filling stations operating in Swindon. So the M4 hydrogen corridor is starting to grow and emerge. Do you want to go on to the next slide now? So in terms of some of the positives, this is my little car. Do you know what, as I said on the previous slide, I've driven electric cars from entry level point through to 150 grand's worth of Tesla, and each of them are brilliant and unique in their own way. But my entry point was as cheap as I could go with a used electric vehicle. I'm on a battery lease model, which we maybe can touch on if that's of interest, but I didn't pay a lot of money for my electric car. Frankly, I've only ever seen it. We'll come on to range in a second. The convenience is just superb. Do you know what? We're all now used to mobile phones where you get home at the end of the day and you just plug the thing in as soon as you get in and you forget about it. Same with an electric car. If you're fortunate enough to have off-road parking, it's a very similar experience. You may even find, given that, as Steve pointed out, average daily distances driven is about 12 miles. The amount of time you need to actually regularly charge up is quite intermittent. Some real advantages though, over the cold weather that we've had in recent weeks. Stand in your house, press a button, defrost the car without ever having to set outside, to scrape the glass, to heat the cabin. It also preconditions the battery. That means the battery is at an optimum temperature, a better temperature before you set off on your journey. So it allows you to do a little bit more range by using some of that technology and functionality. The ease of driving, it either goes forwards or it goes backwards. Do you know what? It's just so simple in that regards. Quiet. And I had a number of colleagues who used to say, yeah, but you know what? You can't hear these things coming. You'll crash and pedestrians will step out in front of you. Well, actually, I can't say that I've ever had that experience. Tire noise is a thing. You can hear a car coming when you've got tire noise. So that's a thing. Plus also, where do most people choose to live? Most people choose to live in quiet areas. We choose not to live, if we can, near a motorway where there's a constant rumble of traffic. We seek quiet environments, and therefore I don't see quiet as a detractor and as a negative. And they do have loads of talk. And frankly, the obsession of electrified cars that do these amazingly fast 0 to 60 sprint times, I think it's just a gross distraction. I think my little shopping car there is plenty fast enough for the needs of most motorists. So if we go on to the next slide, tongue in cheek, I've put this as the bad, and actually I don't think that these are bad. So I'm going to just touch on these three things very quickly. So if you pop onto the next slide. So in terms of some costs, I've pulled this data table off Whatcar. You can find it on their website, and they're just trying to do a line-by-line comparison. You know, if you're in the market for a 60 grand Audi e-tron and the competitor is an Audi Q5, well, actually, there's a whole bunch of different operating costs between the two of those. And my rough estimate says, well, about 3.5 years in, the cost of the electric, you'll be ahead after that time. Similarly, at the lower price point, at the bottom of that table, you've got VW ID3 retailing at 35 versus a petrol Golf at 27. That's a 6-year. So there is quite a difference in there. But, you know, pick middle of the table, you've got Tesla Model 3 on the short range versus a comparative BMW. And it's, give or take, it's about the same price. So again, as Steve was saying, there's some price parity already in the market, depending on what you're looking at. There are a few mechanical parts, which makes servicing easier. There are still some grants available at the lower price point for retail prices, and the tax is still favorable. But ultimately, the key piece is look at the total cost of ownership. Ticket prices, they can look higher, and that can be perceived as a barrier, but actually look at everything in the mix. And that's certainly what we were looking at from a fleet point of view. Insurance, service, off the road time, repair bills, look at everything in the round before deciding outright that an electric vehicle is too expensive. Next slide. One of the other things that's often thrown out there is that, well, the carbon footprint of an electric car is actually higher. Do you know what? There's more energy, there's more embodied impact associated with producing the batteries. So this chart is taken straight out of a report published by Polestar, which is the model shown at the bottom there. It's Polestar 2. And a life cycle assessment is essentially a technical report that tries to work out what is the environmental impact of that vehicle from the start of the value chain, so essentially extraction materials through manufacturing, through to use, being driven by consumers, through to disposal. And so the orange line on that, that's their reference line for an internal combustion engine, their XC40. And okay, at the very start there, yes, the carbon footprint of the manufacturing is lower for the ICE when compared to the Polestar 2. However, depending on what fuel you end up putting in it, so whether it is just they're taking a global energy mix, a European mix, or a fully renewable power point, then actually after about 50,000 miles, the electric vehicle on renewable energy is already ahead on the CO2 emissions, so it's far lower down. Coming to the question that we had just at the end of that last piece, just a quick bit of maths. The government standard reference point is about 160 grams per kilometre for an average sized diesel car. I get about 5 kilometres per kilowatt hour. The standard electric grid mix in the UK is about 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which makes that about 40 grams. So we're talking 160 for a diesel versus 40 if you're on a standard UK electricity grid mix, or that's 0 if you're on renewable tariff. So just to throw that one in. Then the next slide, if we can. So I find it quite comical that the first two speakers here have already thrown in references to ZapMap, and then we've got a speaker from ZapMap later on as well. So from a charging point of view, do you know what, here I thought I'd just pull this in for Chippenham. Actually, that's a whole raft of chargers, public charging. That's actually a really positive image for a town the size of Chippenham, particularly when compared to Cheltenham, where I'm based. Those the number of chargers there, and those aren't just individual, there's multiple ones at some of those locations as well, of different speeds. And again, as was said by the earlier speaker, the speed of charger is relevant. Destination charging, so going to a shop or a hotel, a retail park, where a vehicle is going to be sat for a period of time, doesn't need to be rapidly charged at every opportunity. And the costly infrastructure of rapid charging, getting so much energy into a vehicle in a short period of time, that's a huge capital expenditure that needs to be factored in. So if we bounce on to the next one.
Sorry, Andrew, are you near the end? We need to move on to the next one in a minute.
This is my last slide. This is my very last one. So the thing I kind of wanted to close on was, whilst we've touched on electric vehicles as technology, my challenge actually is, as a society, as a country, we shouldn't be seeking ultimately for a like-for-like replacement of fossil fuels. We are at a real juncture where climate change is a major threat moving forward, and we need bigger ideas to address that challenge. And part of that challenge is, why do we strive for personal vehicle ownership? Those assets are used about 3% of their useful life, which I'm sure is going to come onto a car club conversation in a minute. They depreciate in value heavily. A sharing economy is more what we need. There's not sufficient resources globally to switch everyone into an electric vehicle. Therefore, we need to be considering what those alternatives are. Hydrogen, I've mentioned on there. There's those ownership models, but there's the public transport, which and active travel, all of which need to be factored in there. So rather than us just jumping into I've got to get out of my diesel car and I've got to get into a battery electric car, I think I would encourage, put the brakes on there and say, well, actually, what are my alternatives that move us away from personal vehicle ownership models? And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. That was really good. So we're pushed for time. So I think, Kerry, you're just going to summarise some of the chat that we had on this one, and then we'll move on quite quickly, I think.
Yeah, just lots of comments and back and forth around charging, both home charging and Bill's experience with expenses with replacing home charging, and then some responses about how to maybe look at that, and then lots of support for rapid charging in Chippenham and support to encourage Wiltshire Council to improve charging points, and some comments about conversations that are ongoing about that. And finally, the issue of EV charging as part of planning and building regulations, and the need for that to be to be enforced if this is going to improve, and the powers of Chippenham Town Council versus Wiltshire regarding that. So all around sort of the issue of charging and where to charge and how quickly to charge. So far in the chat, there might have been a couple more come in while I was speaking, but I think I would say to everybody, just scroll up and down in the chat. There's lots of interesting conversation back and forth there, and questions and answers going on, as well as listening to the next speaker.
Okay, and Andrew, we might come back to you some questions at the end. I just don't want to let the other speakers who prepared.
No problems.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. So we move on to Alan, who's going to talk to us about the Tisbury Electric Car Club.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. That's I'll start with my picture just so you can see who I am. But because my bandwidth is this little part of Southwest Wiltshire is the bandwidth is terrible, I might actually just dump my picture so that you just get the sound coming from me. I hope that's okay. So if we could just move on to that first slide, Jess. I can't see it myself yet.
Yep. Bear with me 1 second. I'll just grab it now.
I could sing, but I won't put anybody through that while she's looking.
Or do a card trick, maybe.
Yeah, I need to have something up my sleeve for these occasions, so, or a good joke, but I won't. Just nobody look at Jess, because it's harder to find the slide when everybody's looking at you.
No, we're looking the other way now.
Excellent.
Terrible weather, isn't it? Sorry.
Here we go.
Right. So I whiz through I'll whiz through the slides fairly quickly, but just to say that going on to the next one straight away then, Jess, just to say that this is really a case study of an electric car share club in sleepy Southwest Wilts. It's hosted by Nada Community Energy, which is a community benefit society, only been going for about 7 years, or 6.5 really. Community benefit societies, as you probably know, are part business, part charity. They're sort of, they're somewhere in between. And the idea is that they're a non-profit making, and any excess income over expenditure goes into projects that benefit the community. But they do have shareholders, and the shareholders get a reasonable return on their investment. In our case, a 5% return over a sort of 20-year investment. And we've had two shares offers locally, which all about solar installations, and there you see the details there, and they've been very successful. But the sort of the benefits are that we try and do other things locally of a sustainability nature. The Electric Car Club is one of those. We've also looked at ground source heat pumps for schools and air source heat pumps for fuel poor homes and various other community benefits. Next slide, please. Yes. So the idea was that we would try and set up a car club, and car clubs, as we know, we've heard, are quite successful in urban areas, but they're much less usual, much rarer in rural areas. There are some examples around the place, and it's beginning to take off in a bigger way, but it's much harder because the footprint, as it were, for potential customers is much thinner. And so to make these things wash their own face is much more of a challenge. But that was the idea we thought we'd try and look at. 100% electric cars, with the idea being to do something that was planet friendly, obviously, reduce pollution and fossil fuel use, but also to provide another option in terms of local transport, because the local transport where we were based, public transport was not great. Bits of it were fine. I'll get onto that in a moment, but otherwise not too good. So, and something was convenient and flexible and affordable and all those other things. Next slide, please, Jess. So Tisbury, which is where we set up our car club. Where is it? Where on earth is Tisbury? Well, it's not even marked on that map, but it's where that arrow point is, somewhere between the A303 and the A30, down in the bottom left-hand corner there, very close to the Dorset border. Next one. and it's a village, but just about. It's a large village, just 2,400 people roughly. And there are little satellite hamlets which make up that number. But it has quite an elderly profile populations. About nearly a third are over 65. There are bus services, but they're pretty few and far between. We are lucky to have a mainline station on the Waterloo Exeter line, which is brilliant, but the trains are pretty infrequent. They were 2 hourly during the lockdown, during the COVID restrictions, but they're coming back to hourly now. There's also a TIS bus service, which is a volunteer-run minibus service for people in need, taking them to essential appointments, etc. We've got general practice, dentist, there's other things as well. Next slide, please. So what we did, we applied to a fund called the Next Generation Fund, which is part of the Power to Change bit of the National Lottery Community Fund. As you know, the National Lottery's got all these different pots, I should say, and this was one particular pot which is trying to support community-based renewable energy solutions. And we, in 2019, we received a £90,000 grant, which is very generous, over well, initially 2 years, but they extended it for 6 months because of the COVID, to look at the feasibility of an electric car club in this sort of area, and to develop a business model that could be shared with other cooperatives. Next slide, please. So these were the steps we took. We did a consumer survey, which was a questionnaire we sent around households, and we got about 100 replies, which is not too bad for this village. And broadly speaking, people like the idea of a car club, and they thought it would help them. They'd probably use it. So a lot of the people replying had 2 cars, and they say, well, this would mean we'll only have 1 car, or we won't use the second car so much, etc. So that survey was quite important to give us an idea of the sorts of people that would use the car. A few people had no car and thought that this would be give them a bit more flexibility. 2 charge points, 2 second-hand cars. We had to set up some telematics and booking software, which we got, in fact, from a European cooperative. Insurance was a struggle, but we managed to find one insurer, which charged us a fortune. We then had to run a publicity campaign, get people interested, get up some local sponsorship, some crowdfunding. Crucial point was developing terms and conditions so that we could make sure we were covered if there were any issues. That was essential as far as the insurance is concerned. Public liability insurance as well as vehicle insurance. We had to develop an induction pack to help people get used to the idea of driving an electric car if they've never done that before. And a little team of volunteers to run the club, and also a help desk. Next slide, please, Jeff. So here are the 2 cars. The one on the left is a relatively new car. Where's that one? That's Sparky, 2017, with not a bad range. And the one on the right is a much older vehicle, pretty poor range, really only good for going to nearby towns, villages, yeah, it's a nice. They're both very nice cars to drive, as we've heard, but there are big differences in terms of range. Next slide, please. And they're located at different points in the village. There's Tisbury, there's the High Street. So one is up at the sports centre, on that one on the left there. That's the longer range one, and the shorter range one is down at bottom right-hand corner there, not far from Tisbury Station. So it's just a quick walk there. So anyway, next slide, please. There's an app as well, which goes with this, which as I say, we got from a Belgian cooperative that runs car clubs, and it's a bit clunky, but it's not too bad. And for those people who are mobile, who are sort of tech friendly and have a mobile phone, it's a piece of cake really, because you can do all you want to do really on that phone. Other people who haven't got that can use the website, or even people who've got no tech at all, as it were, can just phone up. There is a number to ring up, and it can all be done for them most times of the day. Next slide, please. So yes, in terms of what we charge people, there's a £10 membership fee. It takes 2 or 3 days to go through and check their license and make sure that it's all okay and fits the terms and conditions. And these are the sorts of prices we charge: £5.50 for the first hour, much cheaper for subsequent hours. And you know, these are very these are very cheap prices really compared with the commercial hire charges. A bit of blurb there and a bit of sales talk there about there are no extras. No, you know, that's all they pay. Just that plus the membership. All the rest of it is all in. Next slide, please. So we were very much mucked about by the COVID restrictions, but we're just beginning to emerge from that now. We have just reached our target of 60 members. We'd like to have more. Use is still pretty light, actually, but it's steadily increasing. And you know, the hourly rates, as it were, per week are going up steadily. So that's the feedback's very positive. Joining procedure is a clunky process. We're trying to debug it, but it takes, as I say, 3 or 4 days to get through. So you can't just sort of turn up and go. But we're getting better at that. Next slide, please. The big challenges have been raising awareness, getting our membership up, which we're achieving now. As I say, the checking of the driver records is a bit fiddly. We need to have a rota for manning the help desk and troubleshooting. We need some ongoing funding because the initial funding is now finished. So we have to find about £600 or £700 a month. We built up a reasonable fund through crowdfunding and through sponsorship, but we need to think about what happens going forward. We could probably get through this next year, but beyond that is a bit of a question mark. We need to improve the software, as I mentioned. And yes, we are recovering. Next slide, please. I think we're nearly there now. Yes, there is a video to watch if you'd like to watch it. I won't click on it now, otherwise it'll all go a bit weird. But there's the video. Next slide, please. And there's some contact numbers if you want them. So I think that may be the last slide. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much indeed. So,
yep.
Kerry, are there any burning questions for Alan? We maybe do a couple of minutes.
Yeah, a couple. There's a couple. Is there a minimum and maximum age for drivers in the car club?
Yes, good question. Yes, the minimum age is 20. The maximum is 70, but we can negotiate on an individual basis with the insurer, and providing that person has a clean license and there are no other medical issues, they can get they can be added to the list, as it were. They may sometimes charge an excess of, say, £500 excess, if or even £1,000 if people have got a bit of a record of an endorsement in the last 3 years. But yeah, that can be negotiated. It's basically from 20 to 70, really.
And do your members always find that they can get a car when they need one? Has that been an issue?
That's not been an issue for us because, as I say, it's rather underused at the moment. There've been a few instances of clashes, but on the whole, it's all gone fairly smoothly, and people on the whole are finding it a pleasant and enjoyable experience. We've had some good feedback, but no, that's not an issue for us so far.
And there's just been some comments about how useful it would be to have access to sort of all this work and understanding of the processes and learning you've already been through as a group for other people that would be other areas that might be interested in doing the same thing. And just as a final reflection from you, in addition to sort of getting the money and working out all of these different steps and processes, is there anything in particular about the people involved or the way you work as a village or as a group of people that has meant that this has made it possible to do this in your area, sort of, because often it's about more than just picking up a set of processes and putting them down somewhere else? And I just wondered if you had any reflections on that.
Well, the main reflection there is that we've always been a very sustainability conscious, very sort of green-minded village, and we've had an active sort of project for several years now. So there has been a group, a core of very enthusiastic people who are prepared to put in time and effort into this. When we had the grant, we had some paid employees who developed a lot of that stuff. But now we're relying just on volunteers. But luckily, we've got enough volunteers to keep that going at a pretty minimal cost. We just have to see how it plays out.
That's fantastic, Alan. Thank you. And if you can do it in a village like Tisbury, you just imagine what we could do in bigger towns. Very inspiring. We've only got a few minutes left for Joseph from ZapMap. So Joseph, if you want to try and do it in as quick as you can, then you'll have some time for questions at the end. And if we've got any time at all before we have to finish, we can sort of have the questions at the panel more generally. But what I will do, I will put my email contact so you can send questions subsequent to this, and we'll pick those up afterwards. So over to you, Joseph.
Yeah, lovely. I think I'll be able to whiz through. I've got some nice pre-introductions from some previous things. Yeah, we can probably jump straight into the next slide. Thanks. Yeah, so ZapMap, what are we here for? It's all about accelerating the shift to electric vehicles and drive towards zero carbon mobility. So our key ideas is basically to make all of the difficulties of transitioning to a completely new drivetrain and mode of transport, to make that easier. So promoting it to more people and demystifying it so that it's more people can see themselves owning an EV. And then, as I said before, you sit in one, you realize how many tools there are available to you, and it gets a lot easier. So yeah, effectively demystification and tool creation is our thing. Charging made simple. If you go to the next one, I'll sort of whiz through this journey, but effectively the company has been about this principle for the whole of its history. Way back when we were just Next Green Car, and that was all about effectively comparing different ICEs, different plug-in hybrids and stuff. A lot of the pure electrics, there wasn't quite the choice that you had available today, but the whole way through it's been giving people the information they need to be able to more easily make that transition. So some of the things mentioned before around long-term price parity and how it's more expensive now, but how much do you save on fuel cost over time? Similar to the graph that Andrew showed from Polestar, we've done various sort of life cycle analyses that completely agree with that the initial carbon cost of an EV is often a fair bit higher than an ICE, but very quickly, relatively quickly, depending on the car, you get significant, you start to come out ahead quite a lot. And each stage in this journey is kind of unlocking a different level of difficulty, a different blocker in the EV chain. So at the start of it is, where are these points? So it's the launch of ZapMap. Then you've got, what are they being used right now? So as has been said before, the model for charging an EV is a little bit different to filling up a petrol vehicle. Vehicles can occupy spaces for for a reasonable amount of time. So then it's, who is this being used? Is it sensible for me to go and use this? That's what our dynamic partnerships allow. Route planning. So, when you're planning these longer journeys into areas of the country you've not been before, what are the best chargers to use that fit your criteria? And then the last one, the second to last one there is ZapPay, and it's a similar blocker of people juggling different payment methods and different membership cards, and that's another barrier to entry. So it's effectively this ongoing journey to try and remove those barriers to entry to the EV ownership, EV use. If we go to the next one. There's a lot of lovely KPIs here and we're very proud of all of them. The two ones I'd like to point out is this 70% of dynamic and live data. So this, quite a sizable stretch of the UK network is something that you can look at, and of the order of 5 minutes ago, you can tell, is someone using that right now? And that's just sort of changes the game a fair bit around whether or not you can, when it comes to planning journeys. The other one that I'd like to point out that we're all very, very proud of at ZapMap is the 40,000 plus user comments a month. So, the owning an EV isn't a solo challenge. There is an extremely vibrant community of fellow EV owners out there who, there's people who, there's one of our favorite stories, people have left their charging cable a charger, yet through comments, on our app and other friendly users, they've actually arranged to meet back up with another EV driver and get their cable back. and there's, you know, all kinds of stories like these, and generally, yeah, EV drivers are very friendly and happy to help each other out. And we are very proud to be one of the platforms they do that on. Yeah, if you, next slide, please. So yeah, this is kind of the summary of the journey that I was saying before of, you know, finding the points that are available, planning those long journeys, having this ability to effectively use one solution to pay as well as find things, which takes the subscription sort of boundary away, and then share and update things with each other. And a new, you know, and the next sort of phase from 4 is effectively expanding our capability. So, you know, what are the next barriers to entry? One of them, one that we've released a little while ago, is in-car support. So that's CarPlay and Android Auto. And I'll stick on this slide for a little bit, but basically we're expanding our capability in a few other areas. So one is in terms of we have an upcoming fleet proposition, because as much as the penetration to the sort of user, the car owner market is accelerating, and there's lots of incentives to keep it accelerating. As some of the previous speakers have said, you know, large scale fleets transitioning there, you know, that there's a lot of barriers to entry for them as well. There's different considerations they have to address that we're looking to make easier. There's been some questions previously around carbon emissions, and, you know, you have it's, you know, clear to see that the electricity, even in the average grid mix, is going to be cleaner than conventional ICE. But we have partnered with some shockingly intelligent people from a Cambridge startup. They're actually calculating the carbon intensity of basically every region in the country. So, you know, taking account even into, you know, solar panels on roofs. And so you can actually start soon. We haven't released this yet, but I'm allowed to tell people about it, to actually plan a journey, not just based on things like reliability, but also green credentials. You know, effectively, can you plot a route from London to Glasgow without ever consuming, you know, producing a single bit of carbon from your journey? And as the grid gets greener and as these features roll out, that gets easier and easier. And I think we can go to the next slide now. Yeah, and effectively we're excited to roll out all of these new things, and we've also rolled out some subscription plans to basically allow us to keep making, you know, keep reaching into these new areas and keep closing off these boundaries to entry. And I think I sped through that well enough, and I'm happy to open some questions.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Yeah, we've got about a minute and a half for questions, and then I'll have to do a quick wrap up to finish at 8. So over to you, Kerry.
2 really quick questions. So lots and lots of love is that map, but will you be expanding into Europe, going Europe wide? And have you thought about building on that community to introduce a user feedback charger score, so where reliability is verified and the speed is verified, and that's added into the filtering capabilities, a sort of TripAdvisor?
I can say, so the second one, answer very quickly, which is yes, because and that we already have that functionality that already exists. There's the user rating against charge point. So when you go there and you check in, you're allowed to rate your experience effectively. You know, is it well lit? Is there lots of facilities? Was it very reliable? How was the user experience? All of these things. And they do feed into that is at the moment, the primary metric we use to guide people on routes. The default is user reliability. The other one around international expansion is 100%. Yes, we are. We have lots of internationalization planning going on right now, and we have European markets in sight for sure.
I think we could carry on for probably 2 hours on this topic, but we're going to have to wrap it up because we've only got an hour. So I'm just going to I put my council email address in the chat, so if you've got really burning questions, I'm happy to pass those on to the speakers. I can't guarantee answers, but I'm happy to do that. So I'd just like to thank all the speakers, Steve, Andrew, Alan and Joseph, and to thank Kerry for excellent management of the chat and the questions, and to thank Matt Kirby and Jessica Mantle for helping organise this and for the series. And that's it. Thank you everybody for attending, and I think it's been really inspiring, and let's hope we can all be inspired and move forward on transitioning. So thanks everybody, have a really good evening.
Cheers.
Thank you everyone. Goodbye.
Have a good evening all.